Hi, my name is Susan Sterling. I decided to do my project on Nation of Islam. Um, so I will start by describing what Islam is. I will then talk about some of the movements that kind of helped spur on Nation of Islam, inspired Nation of Islam. Then I will go through the history of Nation of Islam and talk about some of the controversies later on, and talk about how other other denominations of Islam view members of Nation of Islam. Islam is an Abrahamic religion. It's the second largest religion in the world. It had 1.8 billion adherents in 2015. That number has rose, of course, since then. It's also poised to become the largest religion in the world by the late 21st century. They derive their teaching from the prophets. They define prophets as those who spread the message of God on earth, and messengers are those who transmit divine revelations. Muhammad is believed to be the last of the prophets, and he is who the Quran was revealed to. He is the founder of Islam. On the right-hand side, you can see an image with Arabic writing. That is the name of Muhammad. In Islam, they don't believe in icons, so that would be artistic renditions of Muhammad, because they believe that could be a form of idolatry. So you will see a lot of artwork like this where there's a lot of geometric patterns and potentially Arabic words. So there's some that will say Allah's name or Muhammad, but this example says Muhammad. There's two main denominations of Islam. Sunni is the larger denomination. They have about 85% of the world's Muslim population, and Shia is the second largest. They have about 15% of the world's Muslim population. Where the divide comes from is after Muhammad died, they did not agree on who the successor of the religion was, and over time, they have become more theologically different. People who are Muslims have several beliefs that they adhere to. So they have the 6 articles, which the first is the oneness of Allah. They are a monotheistic religion. They do not believe in multiple gods. They believe in angels. They believe in the books of Allah, so that encompasses the Quran, of course, but that also has the Gospels and some Jewish books like the Torah. They believe in the prophets and messengers of Allah. They believe in the Day of Judgment and the divine decree. Then they also uphold the 5 pillars, which these are actions that Muslims perform. So the first is a profession of faith. The second is a prayer, which they pray multiple times a day. Alms, which means, giving money away specifically, usually, but it could also mean something like volunteering. Fasting, which they do for Ramadan and other religious holidays, and then pilgrimage is the last one. So Muslims are expected to make a journey to Mecca at one time in their lives, as this is where Muhammad is from. The Ahmadiyya movement was an Islamic movement that started out of India, and it spread to the United States in the early 20th century. In the 1920s, they were primarily focused on bringing together Muslims of different ethnic backgrounds. They had noticed that there was a racial divide between African Muslims and Arab Muslims, and they wanted to bring all of them together under one roof. They operated in Chicago and Detroit between 1920 and 1950, and later on, you will be able to see how both of those cities are very important for Nation of Islam. They're also considered a controversial sect of Islam because of their belief that Muhammad was not the last prophet, which we'll get into that a little bit later, but that is one of the biggest beliefs in Islam, is that Muhammad was the last prophet. The picture is of the man who was the first evangelist who came to America. The Moorish Science Temple was founded by Noble Drew Ali in 1925. His birth name was Timothy Drew. So they held the belief that African Americans are Moorish from Morocco and that they are descendants of the Moabites. Ali proclaimed the belief that the proper religion for African Americans was Islam. He kind of held to the idea that Islam was the original religion that was then stolen through the African slave trade. The Quran is their holy text, and it is written by Noble Drew Ali. It is different from the Quran that other Islamic groups follow. Another interesting thing about the Moorish Science Temple is that each of their followers had ID cards declaring them as Moors, as they call themselves, and they also changed their last names. That was another belief, that their original last names were taken from them, so a lot of them changed their last names to be more Islamically aligned last names. Wahhabism was a movement founded by Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican political activist. It was based on Black nationalism, which can be defined as a sense of cultural pride. He was part of the Return to Africa movement. He believed that African Americans in the United States should move back to Africa, and within that start kind of their own nations or countries. That's kind of also how Liberia got started. He advocated the use of, I will not use that word, but you are able to use it or to read it on the screen. So he advocated the use of that word as a descriptor of people of African descent, as he believed that reclaiming the word would afford respect. Wallace Fard Muhammad is the founder of Nation of Islam. There's not really much evidence about the conclusive origin of his background. While I was doing research for this, I read the files the FBI has on him, and he used many different aliases throughout his lifetime, and he gave a lot of different origin stories to different people, so it is hard to say for sure what his background is. Nation of Islam celebrates his birthday as being February 26th, which they call Savior's Day, and they also believe he was born in Mecca. In 1930, he founded the University of Islam and the Temple of Islam in Detroit, and that's also the year the religion started. Followers of Nation of Islam believe that he is Allah. He disappeared in 1934, and after that, the religion was headed by Elijah Muhammad. So some of the scripture that they used when Wallace Fard Muhammad was kind of spreading around the religion at first, he was using the Bible to proselytize to people, because that was the text that a lot of them were the most familiar with. Later on, he began to criticize and denounce Christianity. The Bible wasn't the only text he used. He used some other text, one of them being Deliverance, which is actually a text that originates within the Jehovah's Witness movement. Members of the Nation of Islam currently look to the Quran for religious influence, but they have a different interpretation of the scriptures than other sects of Islam. Elijah Muhammad was the person who took over Nation of Islam after Wallace Fard Muhammad in 1934. Before that, he was born as Elijah Poole in Sandersville, Georgia on October 7, 1897. He moved from Georgia to Detroit, Michigan with his wife in 1923. There he worked in the automobile industry. He lost his job during the Great Depression, and during this time period when he was unemployed, he met Wallace Fard Muhammad, and he converted to Nation of Islam in 1931, just a year after the religion was started. After converting to Nation of Islam, he changed his name from Elijah Poole to Elijah Muhammad, and within that same year, he was appointed as Chief Minister of the Nation of Islam. He taught against white supremacy, and he spread theological teachings of the origins of the white race, which we will get into here in a minute, talking about some of their beliefs. After he died in 1975, his son, Warith Deen Muhammad, was appointed as his successor. Some of the major beliefs of Nation of Islam is what we're about to go through right now. So first and foremost, they believe that Master Fard Muhammad was Allah in human form. They also believe that Elijah Muhammad was a messenger of God. They believe Islam is the original religion of African Americans in the United States, stolen during the slave trade. So you can kind of see a callback to the Moorish Science Temple and some of their beliefs, and kind of how some of those similar movements could have been an origin in the beliefs that Nation of Islam currently espouses. They also believe that Christianity is the religion of their enslavers and it should be abandoned. They also are advocates of segregation for African American businesses, schools, neighborhoods, and even a separate nation. They believe that African Americans should have a nation of their own. They also believe that humanity originated over 66 trillion years ago, and Allah chose to form himself as a black man. They believe the tribe of Shabazz are the ancestors of all non-white races, and they believe the original humans lived in Mecca and practiced Islam. The original humans they would refer to as Asiatics, and these original humans encompassed all modern-day races, apart from those who are European in origin. So they believe that every other type of race that you can think of is kind of the same race, the same origin of humanity, but people who have European heritage originate separately, and we will get into that origin story in a second. So how white people originated was through Yaqub, who is considered an evil scientist, and he created the white race, and the white race then went on to conquer the other race that existed, which the Asiatics or black people. They believed that white people were allowed to reign over the earth for 6,000 years, but they would be punished for their transgressions against the black race. At the end of the 6,000 years, there would be signs of a great war to come, so they're looking out for signs and prophecies. Elijah Muhammad labeled the end of the 6,000 years as 1914. They believe that the prophet Ezekiel from the Bible saw a vision of the mother plane, and this would be what would destroy the white race. They believe the mother plane is a weapon that was made by black scientists, and Allah allowed its creation in order to save the black race. Malcolm X is one of the most famous practitioners of Nation of Islam. Before he was Malcolm X, he was born as Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. He was in foster care during his childhood. His father passed away and his mother was institutionalized, so he was placed in the foster care system, where he went through several foster homes and different facilities. Later in his life, he was imprisoned for burglary charges, and during this time he joined Nation of Islam, and once he was released, he adopted the name Malcolm X. In Nation of Islam, they hold similar views to the Moorish Science Temple in that the last name of African Americans is not their true last name and it was stolen during the slave trade. So a lot of times they will take on an X as their last name and then later on might get a name that has more Islamic origin. Malcolm X didn't get a new last name apart from the X. That's why he was known as Malcolm X. Once he joined Nation of Islam, he ended up becoming their spokesperson in the 1950s. He was also a political activist, so kind of around the same time period was when Martin Luther King Jr. was politically active. And while he had respect for Martin Luther King Jr., he would still critique him. Where they differed a lot was on their opinions of violence versus nonviolence. So Martin Luther King Jr. very much believed in a nonviolent approach, and Malcolm X criticized him for this. He ended up breaking away from Nation of Islam. He ended up traveling to Mecca at one point, and he kind of converted to a more orthodox, like Sunni Muslim sort of person. And after this point in time, he aligned himself with Dr. King. He even met him in person. When Dr. King was in jail, he actually went to Selma and he spoke with Coretta King, Dr. King's wife. Unfortunately, after his visit to Selma just a few weeks later, he was assassinated on February 21st, 1965. So after Elijah Muhammad died, his son Warthdin Muhammad became the leader. Warthdin Muhammad ended up disbanding the original Nation of Islam, and he moved toward a more orthodox Islamic tradition of Sunni Islam. He converted away from Nation of Islam to a more to Sunni. He did not believe in the idea of Wallace Ford Muhammad being Allah, and he believed that his followers should embrace people of other religious or racial backgrounds. Once he changed away from Nation of Islam, he also changed the name of their organization to be World Community of Al-Islam in the West. As part of this embracing of people of other religious or racial backgrounds, he often met with people of different religions, such as Jewish or Christian people and people who are not African American. Warthdin Muhammad died early September 2008 in Chicago. Louis Farrakhan is the current leader of Nation of Islam. He was born on May 11th, 1933 in New York City as Louis Eugene Walcott. He joined Nation of Islam in 1955. He became assistant minister to Malcolm X and was then appointed to official minister. So before he was official minister, that was Malcolm X's position. And then Malcolm X ended up leaving that specific mosque. So Louis Farrakhan was appointed to his position. And he actually considered Malcolm X a mentor to him, and he maintained this mentee relationship with Malcolm X until he was assassinated. After Malcolm X was assassinated, he was appointed to be the representative of Nation of Islam and minister of the Harlem Mosque. So these were positions Malcolm X held, but they had not been filled after he was excommunicated from the religion, and they hadn't been filled. And they were given to Louis Farrakhan after Malcolm X died. Under Warith Muhammad, he actually joined his organization, but then he tried to reestablish Nation of Islam. So Nation of Islam, in kind of the form it was in, was only gone for about 2 years before Louis Farrakhan reestablished it. Another thing about Louis Farrakhan, he kind of organized this big event. It was called the Million Man March. So on October 16th, 1995, there were a large group of African American men showed up at the National Mall for something called the Million Man March. Louis Farrakhan proposed the idea for the march. He didn't organize it himself, but the National African American Leadership Summit was the organization that was in charge of this event. The purpose for the march was because of the political climate at the time. During this time period, two very famous African American men had very high-profile court cases. So O.J. Simpson was on trial for murder of Nicole Brown Simpson, and Mike Tyson had also been convicted of rape, and they were both kind of seen as pillars in the African American community. So a lot of Black men were unhappy with how Black men had been painted in the media at this time, and they also felt like the current people holding political positions were conservative-leaning and looking to cut social programs. So while the president was a Democrat, President Clinton, he was considered a conservative-leaning Democrat, so they were not exactly hopeful of what he would do for their community. The event actually started with a Muslim and a Christian prayer, and it was led by speakers who were prominent members of the Black community. So some of the speakers were Rosa Parks, Maya Angelou, and Martin Luther King III, who were all considered very important pillars of the African American community, very important to the civil rights, all of the civil rights stuff that had happened back in the day. So in the modern day Nation of Islam, Farrakhan, of course, is the leader, and he also started it. He helped reestablish it in Chicago after Warith Deen Muhammad kind of dismantled the organization. He began publishing The Final Call, which is their media outlet, which you can actually still read today. He also tried to help move Nation of Islam outside of the U.S. He established some contact with foreign political leaders, and one of these was Muammar al-Gaddafi, who was the dictator of Libya. Farrakhan is very against white supremacy and talks about it a lot, and he also tries to encourage the upliftment of African American communities. People who are members of Nation of Islam, traditional Muslim traditions like Ramadan, and they will also abstain from alcohol and pork. So some of the criticism or controversies Farrakhan especially has received have been from these two organizations, the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League. So the Southern Poverty Law Center has published many statements regarding their view on Nation of Islam, especially since Farrakhan has taken over. They have accused Nation of Islam of anti-Semitism, homophobia, and racism, and the Anti-Defamation League has had similar things to say. They've called the organization anti-Semitic and bigoted. So these are some of the statements Farrakhan has made. They're paraphrased, but they are statements that have been categorized as anti-Semitic, homophobic, and racist. So he has called, at one point in time, he has called Hitler a great man. He has called Judaism a dirty religion. He has also touted the conspiracy theory that the United States government is involved in a conspiracy to make African Americans homosexual and in doing so chemically castrated the community so that less African Americans are being born. He also said that white people are biologically inferior and satanic in nature. Some of the language he's used to describe white people have been, white devils, blue-eyed devils, things along those lines. He also supports a separate state for African Americans. So to this day, Farrakhan still supports segregation. He still kind of supports the movement of making a separate nation for African Americans. So what do mainline Muslims kind of think about Nation of Islam? People who are practitioners of Sunni and Shia Islam don't think that people who are part of Nation of Islam are Muslims. There are many reasons for this, but it's mostly theological. They think that the theological views that are held by Nation of Islam are seen as heretical. One of the most critical beliefs is that Muhammad was the last prophet, and the Nation of Islam doesn't adhere to that teaching. Mainline Islam also doesn't hold a lot of the same views around racial groups like Nation of Islam, holds to that white people are created separately. Mainline Muslims don't believe that. So there are some very stark theological differences in opinion. These are my sources. I'll spend a couple seconds on each one so you can kind of get a good look at them. And thank you for watching.